Well, today I'll be presenting on some of our conservation work for American burying beetles. And I'll be focusing on the Middle Niobrara biologically unique landscape, which is located in north central Nebraska. So this is just to provide some geographic context. The American burying beetle is a large carrion beetle that benefits people and nutrient cycles by recycling small to medium-sized animal carcasses. And during the brood rearing season in July, a pair of American burying beetle, or ABB, will bury a carcass underground and lay eggs nearby, and then the parents stay to protect their young and feed them from the carcass. So earlier in the conference, we discussed how the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project focuses our conservation efforts on restoring ecosystem function at large scales, but conservation funding is often tied to specific species. And the American burying beetle is a useful target for ecosystem restoration because of its strong links to multiple plant and animal communities, including small mammal and bird communities. So Nebraska Game and Parks Commission was awarded a state wildlife grant that was active from 2017 to 2021 for American burying beetle conservation and adaptive management. And we use those funds primarily to improve habitat for ABB on private properties. Here in north central Nebraska, that's generally on ranches. And that work typically takes the form of cedar removal, grazing management, prescribed fire, and potentially reseeding of crop ground back to native prairie. We worked in several BULs with the state wildlife grant, but I'm going to be focusing on the Middle Niobrara BUL in this talk. One of the tools we have to help us select sites for ABB habitat improvement projects is a species distribution model, or an SDM. The citation for the paper published in 2014 that described the model development for ABB is at the bottom of the slide here. We'll refer to it as Jarzynski et al. This model was developed by a team of organizations led by the Rainwater Basin Joint Venture. And the SDM allows conservation practitioners and planners to identify and target good locations where habitat management will provide the greatest benefit to the most American burying beetles. So it basically increases cost effectiveness of conservation practices by targeting areas where ABB is actually present. So on this map, you can see areas that are blue on the map are areas that the model identified as having a low probability of ABB presence, or a low occupancy probability, close to zero in this. And areas that are orange have a very high probability of hosting American burying beetles, close to 99% or 0.99 at the upper range. And this is a zoom in on the Middle Niobrara BUL. It's outlined in black with that SDM. It's a pretty cool, useful model. The three variables with the strongest positive relationships with American burying beetle were loamy sand, wetlands and wet meadow, and precipitation. There are some limits that the authors acknowledge that we need to be aware of as we use it. This data is extrapolated from limited survey areas, and American burying beetles are very mobile and might be flying into different places to reach an attractive carcass for short-term feeding. So where they're spending their time during the brood rearing season in July might be different from where they're spending their time in August, when we're all running surveys for this species. At that time, they're just feeding and preparing to overwinter. So the other limitation that really interested me most as a biologist is that the authors did identify a potential bias against woodland areas due to an absence of ABB from a large number of survey traps around Nebraska National Forest in Halsey. And that's pretty relevant in the Middle Niobrara BUL in particular, because it's at the northern edge of this model. And we have a lot of forested river corridors here that reduce the likelihood of that ABB occupancy probability in some parts of the BUL. So there are indications from other research elsewhere in the state that the type of woodland might matter. Native pine and oak woodlands might have a different effect on ABB from dense cedar canopy cover elsewhere in the sandhills. And since the model does not distinguish between forest types, that was something that we were sort of interested to look at. So in addition to the species distribution model, we have several other tools we can use to select ABB habitat improvement project sites. We also have the Nebraska Natural Heritage Database with known species records that we can look at. And we can also just look at a site and look for those variables that are associated with ABB occupancy, like loamy sand, wetlands, and wet meadows. And also look for negative associations. So Drzewski et al. Did identify a negative relationship with development and cropland and loamy soil. So we can look for those things on site to decide if we want to move forward with a project. And we can also use research from other parts of the state. Allison Ludwig will be talking next in the session, so stick around for that. In the Lusk Canyon, she found a strong positive association with grasslands, negative associations with dense cedar canopy, and a weak positive association with trees. So there's something interesting going on there. And she did find that cedar control and grassland management initiatives have had positive impacts on American burying beetle populations. So this is a photo of an example habitat improvement project we funded with the state wildlife grant, 280 acres of cedar removal and prescribed fire in Rock County. And we selected the site based on several factors. So we did look at past surveys that had recorded American burying beetle nearby. When we looked at the SDM values on the site, it showed an 80% probability of ABB presence on the site. So that's nice and high. And looking at this site, we could see that there were factors there that were associated with American burying beetle. It had rolling hills of dry sandy soils with standing water or soil saturation in low areas. And it was located within a core of intact grasslands. We had also completed multiple grassland enhancement projects nearby in prior years. So this was a nice way to expand that effort. And this project was a little bit different. These are a couple photos from it. A little different from a typical tree removal project. We had contractors come in and cut only cedars taller than 3 feet. That reduced the cost of the tree removal because they could leave everything less than 3 feet. And then the landowner burned the project area about a year later to kill the remaining trees. And they had really good mortality rates. It was a really nice, cost-effective grassland restoration project. The second project highlight I have is a 1,082 acre burn, also in Rock County. This landowner had already cut cedar trees that had been expanding out of the draw, which you can see running through the top half of this photo. We used the state wildlife grant to provide technical and cost share assistance for burn about 3 years after that initial cedar removal. And the purpose of the burn was to kill cedar that were reestablishing and also kill cedars that had been inaccessible for the first round of tree removal. There were also, of course, additional benefits for the plant community and cattle production on the site. And when we selected the site for funding, we looked at records of American burying beetles captured very nearby. And we saw that the SDM value was, again, at about 80%, so a high probability of American burying beetles being present on the site. We had wetlands along the creek. And the site was located, again, in a core of intact grasslands. So this was another good candidate for habitat improvement project funding. And in the end, the landowner collaborated with Game and Parks to include the wildlife management area to the north of the property. So the actual burn unit ended up about 1,285 acres. This photo gives you a nice perspective of the scale of this burn. We were burning on this side of the creek and looking across the creek to the other team's smoke on the horizon there. And these are some of the partners we work with regularly to fund and implement these habitat improvement projects. Without their support, we would not achieve the large scale impacts we aim for. All right, so we did use some of the state wildlife grant funds to establish a long-term monitoring route in the Middle Niobrara BUL. And there were a few reasons we decided to do that. One was that we wanted to confirm species status throughout the length of the BUL and identify if there were any gaps in species presence. We also wanted to establish a baseline for long-term monitoring, so that as we run these surveys annually or semi-annually, we'll know if there are any sudden changes in population. Carrion beetles can be good ecological indicators due to their close connections to multiple plant and animal community features. So it's just useful information to have. At the sample size we have now, we can't run serious statistics on the data set. So these bottom two bullets aren't really possible at this stage. But our current survey route might help us understand how best to use our species distribution model when we're making conservation decisions, especially when we were thinking about some of the biases in the model that I described earlier. So for our surveys, we followed standard American burying beetle survey protocols from US Fish and Wildlife Service. We used a pitfall trap, a bucket dug into the ground. There was one at each of 8 sites spaced evenly throughout the BUL. And we baited each bucket with a rack that had been ripened in the heat for several days. So it was nice and fragrant and would attract all of the carrion beetles in the area. And for 5 days in August each year, 2019, 2020, and 2021, we counted all of the carrion beetles we captured each day. Any ABB that we captured, we tagged before we released them with the numbered tags that beekeepers use on honeybees so that we can avoid double counting individuals in case they might return to survey traps multiple nights in a row. All right, so we're getting into some results here. This is a map of the BUL outlined in black with the SDM overlaid on it. Each point is a survey trap, and the number is the cumulative total of the American burying beetles that we detected at that trap over the course of the 3 years of surveys. So it's a cumulative total. All of our survey traps detected American burying beetles. One site at Bobcat WMA only had 1 beetle, which we captured on the last day of surveys in 2021. So that was a 0 for a long time. Interestingly, that site actually had the highest occupancy probability in the species distribution model. It had an OP of 81%. And so that's kind of interesting to think about. This site had different soils. It had calcium-rich, chalky, loamy residuals from sandstone weathering mixed in with the sand. So that might have been a factor. There's also quite a lot of young, medium density cedar encroachment in the surrounding grasslands, as well as some pivots nearby. So I'm kind of curious if maybe the pivots and the cedar encroachment weren't as prominent when the species distribution model was developed in 2011 through 2014. I'm kind of interested in looking into that more. Our lowest occupancy probability of all the sites was 5% at Thomas Creek Wildlife Management Area, and that did have a low number of American burying beetle captures, so that is consistent with the species distribution model. The site with the highest number of American burying beetle captures was our survey trap at Fort Niobrara National Wildlife Refuge, which had 82 captures over the 3 years. That site also had our second lowest occupancy probability at just 9%. The site is located near Prairie Dog Town, which makes sense, right? Prairie dogs are in the right size range for carcasses for American burying beetle. The dog town was in decline in 2020 and had disappeared by our 2021 survey season, but we still captured 14 American burying beetles there in 2021. So that was pretty interesting to see. The second highest number of American burying beetle captures was at our survey trap at Anderson Bridge Wildlife Management Area, which had 57 captures, and that had an occupancy probability of 41%. So based on my understanding of the species distribution model, a major factor in depressing the occupancy probabilities for those 2 high sites was probably the tree coverage. Both of these sites have extensive riparian oak and pine woodlands surrounded by relatively treeless grasslands and active management to control cedar. So our survey and our species distribution model did provide some complementary information on American burying beetle distributions within the Middle Niobrara BUL. Native pine and oak woodlands don't appear to be much of a deterrent for American burying beetles feeding at this stage in their life cycle in the Middle Niobrara BUL. So that does help confirm that there might be potentially an artificial bias in the SDM for forest cover. But I mean, we should keep in mind that our surveys are limited by some of the same factors as the species distribution model. Beetles might be flying into the sites over a mile on any given night to make use of attractive temporary food sources. And so they may not necessarily be in places where they would be found during the brood rearing season. So something to keep in mind as we move forward with this information. And we can synthesize this information to help us think about how we might adapt as the climate continues to change. Our sandy soils are quite different from many other parts of the state. Sandy soils drain and dry out quickly. Sand alone would be really easy for beetles to dig in to bury carcasses, but it might be too dry and unstable to be ideal for brood rearing, which is probably why Jarzynski saw an association with loamy content and wetland habitats to compensate for those dry and sandy soils. They have a nice discussion about that in that paper. And we only have 3 data points right now. But we do see anecdotally that we captured more beetles in years with high rainfalls when we had widespread flooding and very abundant wet meadows. We had fewer beetles this past August in 2021 when we were drier than average and a lot of the water in wet meadows receded as the water tables dropped. And knowing that our summers may be drier and hotter moving forward, we may need to adjust how we approach or prioritize wet meadows. Maybe we need to start giving preference to conservation projects for grazing, fire, and tree removal that have nearby areas that are consistently wet, such as wet meadows and areas with high water tables that are more likely to sustain soil moisture as summer precipitation declines. So these are the conclusions from our surveys. We did find that American burying beetle are present throughout the BUL, and we've established a baseline for monitoring. The species distribution model and our long-term surveys are complementary sources of information. Native pine and oak woodlands are not necessarily a deterrent for ABB in the Middle Niobrara BUL. So we've kind of helped to confirm the author's suspicions that the SDM is potentially biased against forest cover. And we may want to prioritize areas with wet meadows and high water tables that are more likely to sustain soil moisture as summer precipitation declines and the climate changes. Here's a long list of volunteers and assistants from multiple different agencies who were really helpful with our surveys. A special shout out to Allison Bather. She helped not only with surveys, but also did a lot of error checking on our data set, which was really helpful. And that's what I have. Any questions?